Welcome to the All Creatures Podcast. This is Chris, and today I am joined with Dr. Rob Hilsenroth, the Executive Director for the American Association for Zoo Veterinarians. Welcome, Rob.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to be here, Chris.
I'm so, excited to finally get to talk to you. We've been planning this for a couple months. Before we get going, I have to tell you this, and I have to make an admission. When I was a professor at UF or at Clemson, and I'd always tell my students, I went down the PhD route. Yeah, I'm a research scientist teaching about animals, but my dream job to this day, and I'm telling you, I'm not going to vet school ever because I cannot handle 4 more years of med school. But my dream job was to be a zoo veterinarian and particularly working for the San Diego Zoo. So thank you for doing this.
Yeah. I have to tell you, the deans at the veterinary schools tell us that about a third of the entering class members say they want to do zoo or wildlife veterinary medicine.
Oh, wow.
And of course, there just aren't that many jobs out there for them to do that. But that's what they tell me, that there's that much interest in it.
Oh, yeah. It's the exotic. I saw it from my students because I was doing pre-vet med, and they all wanted to do exotics, most of them. So I'd tell them, okay, go work at a zoo, go see this. And like you said, there's not a ton of jobs out there for them, but doing critical work for wildlife. Rob, if we could just start, just kind of give listeners your background, where you grew up, how you got involved in zoo medicine.
Okay. I started out as a child, and as most people do, and I was raised in Washington, D.C. area. I did my pre-veterinary medicine in Oklahoma because we had friends of the family who had a ranch out there. And then went to vet school at the University of Georgia because they took students from Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. After graduation, I worked in a small animal practice for a year in Maryland, and then I moved out to Colorado. It had been my dream to get out there and climb a few mountains and do a little skiing and what have you. And I opened a small animal practice. I worked in that practice for actually 19 years, but in the interim, we had a big issue with, I was an officer with the Denver Area Veterinary Medical Society, and parvovirus came along, the disease that dogs get. It hadn't been invented until then, so it comes along, and we had a difficult time getting the media to cooperate with us. This was about in 1980 or 81. Long story short, I got so frustrated with that, I kept bugging the people down at KUSA-TV, Channel 9. And in 1985, they hired me as a part-time stringer reporter as their pet health expert. So it was Dr. Rob, the pet health expert. That led to a call-in Ask the Vet show on KOA radio. I also wrote a column for the Rocky Mountain News, but I was still in practice. In 1991, a foundation that's located in Denver, Morris Animal Foundation, that funds research for dogs, cats, horses, and wildlife, advertised they wanted a veterinarian as a staff veterinary spokesperson. They were looking for a veterinarian with television, radio, public speaking, and writing experience. I said, ooh, that's got my name on it. So I applied for the job and got it. And about 10 months after I got there, their executive director left. They asked me to sit in as interim executive director, which I did. And it turned out after about 6 months with a search firm and all, they said, okay, you're it. So I was executive director, and then I retired from Morris Animal Foundation in 2004. Moved down here to Florida, bought my sailboat, life was good. And then these darn zoo vets started twisting my arm. They needed a new executive director. Theirs was retiring. And basically shamed me into, they said, all that stuff you learned at Morris Animal Foundation, you can't let that just fade into the sunset. You owe us. And so I applied for the job and got it. So in 2005, I started working as the executive director for the American Association of Zoo Veterinarians. And I can honestly say, Chris, I've never worked a day in my life.
Yeah, that is okay. This is going outside the box. For our listeners, I have been doing this too for a year and a half, and it's a labor of love. And whenever I'm sitting here planning interviews, doing research on a species, doing social media, all these things. You're right. I don't feel like I'm working. I feel like it's like my purpose in life, and I love it. Is that how you feel every day?
You bet. You bet. I look forward to it every day. It's just wonderful. The zoo veterinarians are just a whole different group of people, and we can get into this, but they all know each other.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason they know each other is they have to communicate with each other all the time. If you're in a zoo that you have let's say you have two scimitar horned oryxes in your collection, and you come in one day and one of them has a swelling on his shoulder, and you've never seen this before, you're going to get on our website and ask a question, or you're going to get on the phone and talk to people at San Diego Zoo Global who might have 25 of them, or at Brookfield Zoo who might have 15 of them. Mm-hmm. So they talk to each other all the time about their cases. And they also have to collaborate and talk to each other on the research that they do. So it's one big happy family, and it's just the best family in the world, I have to say.
Yeah, I agree with you. And we just did an interview with the San Diego Zoo koala team, and they were talking about ZIMS, zoos sharing mm-hmm. information. Is that the system you're kind of referring to?
Yeah.
Or is it more just pick up the phone? Sorry.
Yeah, it's so all the medical records then go into one database. I mean, it'd be great if veterinarians in small animal practice or equine practice or food animal practice would do the same thing. But we've been doing this in the zoo world for years and years, probably 30 years now. It used to be called MedArcs. And that way, then the medical records can follow an animal as it goes from zoo to zoo, what have you. But it's a very close-knit community.
Rob, I think you should be quiet. I think you just came up with $1 million idea for the small animal and large animal vets. If you come up with that database and you run it to market, you will make a lot of money. So, yeah. Well, maybe I'll edit that part out. No, I'm just kidding. That's somebody out there. Do it for the animals. So you were mostly small animal practice. Did you ever get to, practicing medicine and knowing physiology and everything you've done, the wealth of information that you've developed over the years, did you work a lot with wildlife in your career?
I did a little bit. Yeah. I actually, in my veterinary practice, I opened that in 1972. It was a long time ago. And I was the veterinarian in town who would see the snakes and other reptiles and the birds and pocket pets, gerbils, hamsters, and what have you. But then as time went on, we had specialty practices opening up in Denver that did nothing but birds. And so I would refer them to those animals. But I never actually worked in a zoo situation.
Right. But I mean, it's still, you're right. It is different because I've worked with a couple of zoo vets too, and it is a definitely different animal. And God, that's why, I don't know. I think personally, that's why I always wanted to be a zoo vet is you have hundreds of species, which again, that's challenging in itself. It's, not just a dog cat physiology. You're talking, like you said, Arabian oryx physiology, elephant physiology, reptile physiology, right? So they've got a big challenge.
Yeah. And then down to the hummingbird you're going to see next, and then a couple of frogs. And I mean, you've got to have access to all of the information, and know most of it by heart. Right.
Yeah. I have the greatest respect for them and, their intelligence. I mean, and wisdom. They, work hard every day, working with these animals. What exactly is the AAVS mission?
So our mission actually is to empower the members to advance the profession and enhance wild animal health, welfare, and conservation. And we do this with four different ways. We advance the health and welfare of zoo animals and wildlife through global collaborations with veterinarians, other scientists, and organizations. When I say global, I mean global. We have members. There is a European Association of Zoo and Wildlife Veterinarians, but we have veterinarians from all over the world, and we have a unique category called Developing Nation Limited Membership. So if you're a zoo veterinarian or a wildlife veterinarian, you live in a developing nation and you're working in a developing nation, instead of paying whatever it is, $265 a year for your dues, you pay $7.50 a year. and you get access to the Journal of Zoo and Wildlife Medicine and all the other benefits that we have. So advancing the health is one. The second thing is promoting and funding science-based veterinary medicine through research, education, and the proactive dissemination of the information. And then the third thing is we provide expertise on zoo animal and wildlife, including the development of procedures and policies that affect their health, welfare, and conservation. And the fourth thing is delivering quality professional development and member services. Mm-hmm. One of the big things we do is we have an annual conference, continuing education conference. And probably most of the people listening to this know that medical information is not static. There's been an estimate that about every 7 years, 50% of what we knew is obsolete. So you have to keep up with it. Mm-hmm. But in the zoo veterinary world, you have so many species that you really, really have to go to continuing education. And it's required for licensure in almost all the states in the United States. And so we put on a conference that, is specific for doing lecturing and workshops and all in zoo animals and wildlife. The veterinarian in whatever state, you're in California, mm-hmm. right? Mm-hmm. And veterinarian in California can go to the California Veterinary Medical Association meeting, but she or he is not going to get a course on how to get a liver biopsy in a giraffe.
Right.
There'll be a lot on dogs and cats and horses and pigs and sheep and goats mm-hmm. and cattle and all, but very little on exotic animals. So we do this conference every year, and we have members come from all over the world to this conference, and it's incredible.
Oh, it's, again, to think what maintaining animal health in so many different species, and I mean, do you know, like, the average number of vets? When I was working with San Antonio Zoo, that they had a few on staff. San Diego Zoo, I imagine, has a bunch, but I remember in South Carolina, the Greenville Zoo had one or two that they could refer to. So there's not thousands of wildlife vets in the United States, or I wouldn't say wildlife vets, zoo vets in the United States, right?
Yeah. So our total, unfortunately, we don't keep statistics on how many are working in zoos at the present time, but we have about 1,100 to 1,200 members every year.
Okay, that's good.
And of those, about 150 of them are those developing nations. They're not in the United States. Mm-hmm. And then about another 80 to 90 of them are international veterinarians, mm-hmm. and then about another 150 are students who are veterinary students mm-hmm. who want to pursue careers in zoo and wildlife mm-hmm. medicine. So I'd say there are between 700 and 800 veterinarians who practice primarily in zoos, and they're members of our association.
That's actually a lot more than I thought. So yeah, that's good. That's good.
Yeah.
So one of the things that we've talked about in our podcast, and this has been a consistent message, especially since, Angie and I, again, we're not paid by the AZA or any zoo organization. Angie was a zookeeper for a while. I did some research with people that worked in zoos, but we understand the importance of, accredited zoos. Just a few weeks ago, we released an episode on how important they are to preserving, not only emergency populations, but populations in the wild. So can you kind of, from your perspective, your wealth of information, your wealth of experience, can you kind of just describe or discuss the role that zoos and aquariums are playing today in wildlife conservation?
Yeah, let's look at it historically. A lot of the zoos and a lot of the cities were started from private collections of animals, and this is more than 100 years ago, when some wealthy individuals would go over to Africa and on safari, and they would kill an animal, and the baby would be there, and they didn't know what to do with that. And so they ended up having their own private little collections that then turned into zoos in a lot of the municipalities. So initially, zoos were just menageries of animals, just collections of animals. And I can remember as a kid riding my bike down to the National Zoo in D.C. and, looking at conditions that by today's standard would just not be acceptable, where they'd put as many bear cages as they could in a certain amount of space. with no regard to the welfare of the animal. Then starting in about the 70s and 80s, the zoos started focusing more attention on reproduction and conservation of the species themselves within the zoos. They started cutting down the number of species that they would have, but giving them more space. Or if the zoo could expand, by have acreage next to it and expand, they would do that. Along with that, they started then educating the public, trying to get the people who visit the zoos to realize the plight of all the animals. And when you're standing there looking at an animal eyeball to eyeball, and you're reading a sign that says there are only X number of these left in the wild, they're highly endangered or threatened. You have a chance then to learn some things about conservation yourself. So the idea is to try to educate the public. And then, of course, now zoos have added to their missions that they have to be doing some kind of conservation initiative. So let's say a zoo has a couple of orangutans in their exhibit or space. They might be then doing research on wild orangutans in Borneo, and the veterinarian goes over there, and some of the animal health staff goes over a couple of times a year to work on a project over there. So they've really done a complete change from just being a collection or a menagerie to really having their pulse on fighting extinction, conservation, trying to get the public to understand what's going on, and getting the public to make changes that will positively affect this planet.
Right. It's critical. And I think that's the conservation message. And I'm going to throw this in here real quick. In your view, so you've been doing this for many years. We don't need to go into how many, but many years. Do you feel like, and I don't know if it's just because I've been keeping the pulse of conservation very closely the last couple of years, but do you feel like there's kind of this groundswell of change building around the world right now?
It is, and I call it the race for extinction or race against extinction. And the question that I always ask is, are we going to win the race? We are getting more and more people to be aware of how fragile this planet is, how important biodiversity is. People are making changes in their lifestyles. We've seen this movement once. I think it was National Geographic that finally brought the plastic straw issue to light, about how it's killing our sea turtles and what have you. And they end up in the ocean, and then the sea turtles ingest them, and they become a blockage and life-threatening. So we see changes in people's attitudes, but Chris, here's what I worry about. It's a race to try to make the changes that are going to be necessary to keep these species alive. And the number of people, or the percentage of people on the planet who are doing this work with all this dedication to save one species, a person spends his whole life studying one particular animal and trying to make changes and learn about them. But the number of people who are doing that is less than a 100th of 1% of the population of the world. And we have to communicate to the rest of the planet that it's important for all of us to pitch in, for all of us not to be, just unchecked consumers of everything, and to consider what we're doing to the planet in everything that we do. And it's really it's a difficult situation.
It is. And, one of the things that we've been very fortunate is to be able to interview people like yourself. Some of these we call them conservation heroes, out there in the wild, out there doing the research. And when you were talking, that one scientist in China that's studying the Ili pica, he's making his life goal to save them, but he's by himself, So there's one person out of, what's the population of China? Over 1 billion. That's a great point. Oh, that's a great point. And yeah, I mean, we just need to keep spreading the word. And I just have this feeling, I don't know, Sir David Attenborough or, his message is getting out with our planet recently. So yeah, we're going to keep fighting. We're going to keep recruiting because we all need to do our part. Every single human being on the planet needs to do their part, or we're going to lose a lot of biodiversity. So,
and Chris, let me throw in, we talk about losing biodiversity, and there are people who have an attitude of, well, who cares, and what have you. But as we lose biodiversity and we lose ecosystems, the ultimate animal that's going to suffer from this and become extinct is going to be the two-legged one, you and me. If we don't take care of the planet and all of its environments and all of its ecosystems, ultimately there won't be anything for us. So, being selfish about it, say, what's in it for me? Well, it might not be my grandchildren or my great-grandchildren or my great-great-grandchildren, but somewhere down the road, one of my descendants is going to be affected.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Oh, absolutely. 100%. And that's, the UN report coming out talking about that. I think that's a hard-hitting piece that needs more press, that 1 million species, at risk of extinction, and it's going to influence us. I think if we start weaving that in, it might wake up some of these people that are head in the sand, right? I mean, the good old ostrich head in the sand. Do ostriches stick their heads in the sand?
Yeah. No, they don't, but they do rest with their head flat on the sand. So they, their neck comes down, their head's flat on the sand, so it looks like their head's in the sand, but they don't really stick.
I need to see where that came from. Whenever we cover ostriches, I will answer that question. So one of the things I wanted to ask is, I listened in on a webinar. It was the IUCN One Plan. It was really eye-opening for me as far as zoos and aquariums working with, the IUCN, the granddaddy of them all, as far as, evaluating biodiversity across the planet. And, it was what really woke me up a little bit was some of the species they talked about I'd never heard before. So I guess my question for you is that an organization that you're working with too, or some of the other international organizations that the AAZV works with?
Actually, we don't work specifically with IUCN. We're very closely related with the European Association of Zoo and Wildlife Veterinarians, of course, the Association of Zoos and Aquariums, the European Association of Zoos and Aquariums. And most of our focus is, as veterinarians, is the medical stuff, the medical and reproduction that goes on with the animals. We don't get into habitat and things that have to be done to maintain habitat, although we recognize it's extremely important. You can save a species, but if you have no place to put them, you might not have been doing all you could do. But we do work with other organizations, but mainly the medical and veterinary medical organizations.
Yeah, and that's a great point to kind of ask this question. So one of the things we haven't really discussed a lot in our podcast yet, and we will, and that's so great having you on, is the health of animals in the wild. It's something that we haven't really discussed. We talk a lot of physiology. We do talk genetics, and with you, I want to get to that point. But from your organization's perspective, what is it looking like for many species out there in the wild, their health as they lose their habitat, as they get more encroached upon, from a global perspective? And I don't know if you have any species you can kind of just talk about.
Well, it's really, I can talk from personal experience. I've been working with the Mountain Gorilla Veterinary Project, which is now called Gorilla Doctors, which is the organization that we first sent a veterinarian over to Rwanda back in 1986. Diane Fossey, had done all this research with the mountain gorillas, and she figured out that they're dying off. The population was getting smaller and smaller. There are none in any zoos anywhere in the world. And she was convinced by 1986 that they would be extinct by the year 2000. The human encroachment in the area, because the population, and this is Rwanda and Congo and Uganda, Democratic Republic of Congo and Uganda, What happens is, as the Parc du Volcan gets smaller and smaller, the gorillas migrate higher and higher up into the mountains where the temperature is colder, and they end up with more respiratory disease, and infant mortality goes up dramatically. And so that's an example, a direct example of humans. And when I say human encroachment, so you've got a property owner that butts up against one of the parks where the gorillas live. And next year, when nobody's looking, he cuts down maybe 5 meters or 8 meters or 10 meters into the park, mows it down, cuts down some trees at night. And within 24 or 48 hours, he's got crops planted there. So the park is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And we're just encroaching on the habitat. Chris, in the real big picture, it should be very, very obvious to us humans. Until about 400 years ago, most of the animal species did fine. They were just there were no veterinarians taking care of zoo animals. Well, there weren't very many zoos. Weren't any zoos, I don't think, 400 years ago. They were all in the wild, and they did pretty well. Yeah, there were a couple of extinctions, natural extinctions. I mean, if we didn't believe in extinction, we'd still have dinosaurs running around, right? But this is in the last 400 years, things have changed so much, and the human population has grown so much, and we have destroyed so much habitat, taking lumber from rainforests as an example, that now we have many, many species that are unable to survive on their own, and they need human intervention for them to survive. So it's really we're facing another mass extinction, but this one is pretty much caused by the two-legged creatures.
And we're the research and data has shown that animals are going extinct faster than the previous 5. So in this 6th mass extinction, we're wiping them out at a faster rate. So it is scary. I mean, it's definitely a scary picture. But, what we try to do is to be optimistic and say, look, now, like you said, it's a race against extinction. If we act now, we can reverse some of these trends. I know one of the things that you do, that your organization does, is fund research projects. Yep.
Chris, let me go back while I'm thinking of this. So back to the gorillas. Diane Fossey had forecast or thought that they would be extinct by 2000. When she died, there were a little over 400. And now we have the recent census, we have a little over 1,000 animals. One very small but very significant success story that when you focus all the attention, and I can't tell you how many scientists have been working on this since the mid-'80s, but it's a lot. Veterinarians and biologists and researchers and what have you, but that population is increasing.
And the thing like ecotourism and ways that people can help support the wild animals. And one thing, especially mountain gorillas, there are no mountain gorillas under human care. But I guess this is kind of a good question. You talked about the work you're doing with their, say, respiratory problems. Did any research that was produced in gorillas under human care, has that helped researchers in the field?
All of it helps. That's a golden question, Chris. You bet. So there are a lot of conditions, reproductive conditions, infectious disease conditions, congenital anomalies, things that happen in animals that you're not going to get your hands on a wild population to study very well. Yet in a zoo setting or when animals are under human care, you do have a much, much better chance of studying these conditions. And if the ultimate goal is to then apply what you've learned from these research projects that you're working on to the animals in the wild to make management decisions. And if need be, if there has to be human intervention, I mean, with the mountain gorillas, it's hands off unless the the disease or the condition is really actually caused by a human. So if two male gorillas fight, and we leave them alone, that, if one of them dies from the wounds, that's nature. But if it gets his hand or foot caught in a snare that was set by a human, for other animals, for bushmeat in the forest, then we need to intervene, and we can give them a chance. But back to the original question, the work the research that's done in the zoos is almost always applicable to wild populations.
No, and I think that's a great point, because I can see it from a research standpoint. Some of the work, I did in elephants and manatees and things like that will translate into preserving what's left in the wild. So, I think it's a great message to get to the public, and to keep going to accredited zoos and supporting them. In that sense, I know one of the things your organization does, and you mentioned it earlier, supporting research. Are there any really cool research projects you can talk about that you've either done or are currently doing?
Yeah, there are really some fantastic ones. And let me start by saying, let me go back to, we're using the word research. And to some people, that's a dirty word, and they have visions of, some dark scientist laboratory.
That's a good point.
Most of the research that's done, a lot of it, is what we call non-invasive research, where they can collect fecal samples, urine samples, saliva samples. I mean, even in Rwanda, they get a gorilla will be chewing on a stalk of some kind of plant, and he puts it down. Then the researchers can go pick that up and get the saliva from that gorilla off of that to do research on it. I was interviewing some people down at one of the SeaWorlds, actually SeaWorld in Orlando, and they were doing research on some whales. And they developed a system where they could drive up in a boat next to a right whale, and they have a 14-foot aluminum pole with an upside down funnel on the top and a tube coming out of that funnel. And they ride beside the whale. When the whale takes a breath, he exhales first. And they've got a machine that sucks in that exhaled gases. And they can then analyze and get a tremendous amount of biochemical data about that whale without ever touching him. And, so a lot of the research is done that way without actually touching them. But we funded a study on the green sea turtles. They're primarily herbivorous. They don't eat meat, so they're one of the original vegetarians, I guess. They were able to study with sea turtles that are in captivity, actually at a rehabilitation center at the Georgia Sea Turtle Center. And they were able to then work on a new diet, or specifically formulate a diet that would make the rehabilitation go quicker, that they can apply, for those animals that are in that facility. That was pretty cool study. They've studied a new virus in dolphins called morbillivirus, and they have been studying how that's being distributed in the tissues and what have you. We're funding studies, and we're contributing. There are a lot of people helping to fund, not a lot, several people funding studies on a disease in elephants called elephant herpes, which is a horrific disease. People in Indianapolis know this firsthand. Several months ago, they lost 2 young elephants to herpes, a disease that was prior to 1985 never heard of, and yet now it's found in elephants in zoos as well as elephants in the wild. The folks at Baylor University, at the Human University there, are contributing a tremendous amount of research to trying to understand this disease, how it's spread, and hopefully come up with a vaccine to prevent
So
it.
you're saying that, and I get chills because it really, we just did an episode on African wild dogs, and one of the challenges they're facing is disease. You know, they lost one study out of South Africa. They lost an entire pack to rabies. So these diseases that animals are now suffering, I mean, in your view, is it because we're encroaching upon their habitat, where they're being compressed into these areas, and then they run into, you know, either humans or livestock or our pets, and then those diseases are transmitted?
Yeah. Yeah. And that's, I mean, we refer to this as One Health, and it's the health of our human population, our domestic animal population, and our wild animal population. And it's a triangle, and they're all three interrelated. And you see this everywhere, where the domestic animals, when they are either exposed to or in the same area as some of our wildlife, the wildlife will get the diseases that these have. Tuberculosis is a really good example. We're seeing it in African lions now. And we don't know exactly what the intermediate host had been or what domestic animal transmitted to them. But we're seeing quite a bit of tuberculosis in quite a few of the African animals. Like you said, rabies is rampant now. We see here in the United States, we see raccoons with distemper. Distemper we think of as a dog disease, a canine disease, one of the diseases your puppy gets when you vaccinate. But we're seeing it in raccoons and skunks. So there are plenty of diseases that, because of the proximity of both humans and some of our domestic animals to the wild animals, they're a naive population, and they'll get these diseases.
You're right. Animal health. I don't know why in conservation this isn't more of a discussion. And I think that's your goal and your challenge, right? Is educating, I guess, you know, the people that do work in conservation are aware of it, but all the messaging I'm seeing is protect habitat, you know, these emergency populations under human care, and then trying to do reintroductions. But when you're looking at animal health, my gosh, that is like a huge, huge, huge piece of it, right?
Yeah, it really, really is. It's incredible. One of the things we were talking earlier about ecosystems, and you know, it's important that there are other organizations that help, you know, maintain a habitat and all this kind of stuff. But every single animal in an ecosystem is important. You know, everything from the bacteria in the soil on up. And my wife uses the example. She'll show a picture of a Boeing or any airliner, and she says, "How many rivets in this airplane?" And nobody can answer the question. And they finally say, "Well, Linda, how many rivets are there in that airplane?" She says, "Well, nobody knows." And then she says, "Could you lose a rivet and the plane still fly?" And the answer is yes. "Could you lose 2 rivets and the airplane still flies?" And the answer is probably yes. And she goes, "You go down at what point do you lose that one rivet and the whole thing comes crashing down?" So when we talk about an ecosystem and all the animals that are critical, and the plants, I don't want to ignore the plants, but everything that's critical for that ecosystem, that's why every single animal is as important as the next one, whether it's a little snail or whether it's a megavertebrate like an elephant. They're all very important to those ecosystems, and we have to treat them all with as much respect and care and concern as we can.
I just wanted to, while you're talking about that, it just came across my mind. What's your view on umbrella species? You know, you were talking about elephants, or, you know, I was saying bison, you know, North America, or some of these large megafauna. Do you, from a, I guess, a veterinarian perspective, is that a good strategy if we go in and say, okay, we're going to protect elephant habitat or lion habitat? You know, are you seeing any benefits, I guess, from the health perspective?
Well, from my experience, that's the only way you can get the public's attention, is to use the iconic species that's of the area. You might have more interest in, you know, some smaller animal that's in the forest, let's say hyrax or something.
Mm-hmm.
And you might know as a scientist that that animal could be really, really endangered, and that if they die, something else is going to happen, and, you know, on and on and on. But the habitat supports one of the megavertebrates or a giant panda or, you know, something that the public can relate to. We use that species to get everybody's attention. It's in the oceans, we're seeing a massive decline in our shark populations. Mm-hmm. Part of it is because they're still killing sharks for their fins, for making shark fin soup. Mm-hmm. And part of it is because a lot of fishermen that will kill every shark they catch because they don't want that shark eating the fish they're trying to catch, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But the bottom line is that's the big animal that you can attract people's attention to, because once that primary species is gone or diminished, then the whole ecosystem goes out of balance. So you really, unfortunately, we have to base our decisions on what we bring attention to what we think is the public would like to hear about.
Right. All right. No, yeah, that's a great insight. Thank you. We're talking about animal health. One of the things that concerns me, from my research and my background in, reproductive physiology, genetics, the lack of genetic diversity in a lot of these populations. Now, we are seeing populations, northern elephant seals down to 100. Now there's 100,000. We see cheetahs. We look back at cheetahs, and they were actually a genetic bottleneck thousands of years. That's what they attribute to their lack of genetic diversity today, but they're surviving okay. From your view, is that a major concern, especially with these reintroductions or wild animal health, this lack of genetic diversity?
Yeah. Yes, it's extremely important. What we're seeing is that in our zoo populations, many of the zoos you can trace back to founder animals. Well, so prior to the 1960s, when an animal in a zoo died, you just go out and collect another one, right? That was the way they worked it. And then we figured out that probably wasn't a good idea. So we're looking at reproduction within our human care, human managed collections. And the problem is everything traces back down to a couple of what we call founder animals. So you import, and I think it's important for people to understand this. So let's say a zoo has a male lion and a female lion, and they breed, and you have some cubs, and everybody's really happy, and that's so cool. Well, guess what? None of those animals, other than the original male and female, none of those babies can breed with anybody else, because they're either breeding their brother or their sister or their mother or their father. And we know that inbreeding is not a good thing. And we see all kinds of genetic defects when that happens or what have you. So we have to either move the animals from zoo to zoo, or, as you're well aware, we try to move the gametes, the reproductive material, the sperm and the eggs. And it's a lot less expensive to ship a vial or a couple of straws of semen from one zoo to another and use artificial insemination to breed animals. But in the wild, there would be natural selection, right? You've got a whole herd of gazelle there, and the probability of inbreeding is pretty slim. But in our zoo populations, where each zoo has just several of a certain kind of animal, we don't have that luxury to let have indiscriminate breeding. So genetic diversity is very, very important.
It is. Oh my gosh, we could dork out on this. With your wife, I could dork out all day because I know she does a lot of this stuff. But I guess that brings up a challenge too, because one of the things I think your organization would support, or the veterinarian support, you've mentioned a few times, is reproduction. I don't think people understand how difficult it is, because the work we were doing was, looking at elephant semen and finding ways, because we don't have good ways of freezing it to ship around the world to keep up that genetic diversity. So that was the research we were doing. But I guess from your perspective, how much do we know about reproduction, and 100, 200, 300 species in a zoo.
It's scary how much we don't know.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of the research is being done about that, as you just mentioned with the elephants. I mean, we're pretty good. We've learned how. I mean, this goes back to our agricultural animals when we started freezing semen from bulls mm-hmm. and then shipping that around. And so the protocol for doing that is pretty well tested, very well known, very reliable. You can collect semen from a bull, freeze it, following a certain protocol, and it's pretty much guaranteed to be viable when you thaw it out and inseminate a cow somewhere, halfway around the world. But imagine having to do that for every single species. It's just incredible. So I'll give you a real quick example, and you're probably going to want to talk to Linda at some point.
I will.
But so I've given you a hint. So name a species that breeds once a year for 3 nights in a row, starting 3 nights after the full moon in August. So every August, there's a full moon in August. 3 nights later, this animal breeds just for 3 nights, and then nothing again for another year.
My goodness. Angie's going to love this. She loves stumping me. I went to say rhino?
Yeah, no.
No, it was not rhino.
I'll cut to the chase.
Yes.
It's coral. Staghorn and elkhorn coral.
I would have never guessed that in a million years.
So yeah, and so that our coral reefs are in trouble everywhere around the world.
Yeah.
And there's a great coral restoration project going on in the Florida Keys, where starting 3 nights after the full moon in August, they send down divers and they collect they come out in like sacks of eggs and sacks of semen. And they put them together, take them back to the lab, put them together, and then they raise these. They get a little polyp, mm-hmm. and then they transfer that onto a little piece of tile, and then they raise these animals of these corals up to a certain size to where they're past where all the predators are going to get them. Mm-hmm. And then they drop them back into the ocean for coral restoration. But you can only do that once a year.
Wow.
So Linda and her team are working on developing techniques to freeze coral semen and freeze coral eggs so that every 2 months you might thaw out a batch and do another Head Start program. And 2 months later, do it again and do it again. But we don't know anything about, I shouldn't say anything. We know very, very little about coral, which mm-hmm. a lot of people don't even know that it's an animal. Yeah. And, but when you go just take a walk through the zoo and count the species that are there and say, well, how much can you know about the reproductive physiology and how to freeze semen to be able to transport it and thaw it?
Oh, there's a ton of challenges.
A lot to learn.
Yeah, there's a ton of challenges. Angie did mention we wanted to do coral at some point. It's definitely out of because we're mammalian physiologists, but I think it's something we're going to bring up because 33% of all corals on Earth are heading towards extinction, which is a bit scary. Yeah. Just a few more questions. So right now, from a veterinarian's perspective, what is the greatest threat to our biodiversity, in your opinion?
In my opinion, the greatest threat to biodiversity is too many people. Yeah. I don't know what the carrying capacity is of this planet for humans, but I do know that the issues that we are facing in virtually every case can be traced back to human encroachment or too many people or humans using the natural resources that the animals need to live off of. And I think that's the thing that's the issue.
I agree. And it's something that has always crossed my mind. Once we're heading towards 10 billion people, we can't feed everybody. We know that. But, beyond that, where do we crash? Where does the human population crash? Because nature finds a way to balance it. Big question. I always ask this in my interviews because, I was in a meeting with a bunch of scientists and we were talking about wildlife and, a couple that I, really still respect and love them. They said we didn't have a moral obligation to save wildlife or endangered species. I stood up, read, and are you kidding me? Gave my opinion. But in your opinion, from your experience, your learned opinion, your career, do we as a species have a moral obligation to preserve all the other creatures we share this planet with?
Only if we want humans to survive. If you don't care whether humans survive, then you have no need to care about whether the other animals survive. But ultimately, when these ecosystems crash, it's going to come back to us. And so my philosophy, and I'm not talking about 10 years down the road or 20 years or 50 years. I'm talking about pretty good time period. But if we don't change the direction we're going in, we should care because we want humans to survive.
Yeah. No, it's a great point. It's very true. And it's something I think we need to all talk about more. So final question.
I had one other comment on that too. That from a veterinarian's perspective. So the question is, why should we care, and what have you, especially about the medical problems that our zoo animals and wildlife face. Once we domesticated animals, we started taking care of the animals we had domesticated. So in beef cattle and dairy cattle and what have you, starting 200 years ago, there was a lot of research to bring us up to speed so we could understand the physiology and the disease processes and disease prevention and surgeries and all for these animals, because it had economic value to us because we were raising these animals to feed us. Then after about World War II, we started focusing attention on dogs and cats and other companion animals. Horses were becoming actually companion animals because they weren't just used as work animals on the farm, but they were becoming, quote, pets. Mm-hmm. And so there was a lot of interest and money raised to fund research for dogs and cats. And that was the genesis of Morris Animal Foundation, was that Mark Morris had said for years the only research done on dogs and cats was as a model for human disease. It's about time somebody did something for the animals themselves. But then you move forward into zoo animals and wildlife, and there's nothing out there, or virtually nothing out there. There's this one other organization that I mentioned, but people are donating to a lot of causes to restore habitat all over the world, to manage populations and what have you, but there's very, very little money available to fund the research for the zoo animals and wildlife themselves.
That's, you're reading my mind. That is exactly where I was going, because I personally understand the challenge and trying to get money to fund research in exotic animals or wildlife. So, how can we help you? How can we help the AAZV? I know you fund research. We need much, much more research done. And I think animal health really needs to be, I know for us, from our perspective, I'm going to start pushing it a lot more. Each species we look at, that's a new angle I'm going to start looking at endangered wildlife. But how can our listeners help the AAZV or just animal health, wildlife, animal health in general?
Well, we, Zoo Veterinarians, recognize that we've got to try to do something, if we can, about this issue. So in 2012, we started a program called the Wild Animal Health Fund. And the purpose of the Wild Animal Health Fund is to raise money and then issue grants for research for zoo animals and wildlife. The 100% of the operating cost of the Wild Animal Health Fund is borne by the operation costs of the American Association of Zoo Veterinarians. So when people donate to the Wild Animal Health Fund, 100% of every dollar donated goes to fund the research. We have a research scientific advisory committee that reviews the grant applications. We're getting about 50 grant applications a year now. And we were able to fund between 10 and 12, sometimes 14 research projects each year. We have a cap of $10,000 on them because we just don't have that much money. Mm-hmm. We feel like we're funding about $120,000 this year. we feel like we could be funding $1 million a year if we had the money. Sure. There's that much need for good quality research to help us in this race against extinction. Mm-hmm. So it's the Wild Animal Health Fund, and the listeners, if you're interested, can go to the website. It's just Wild Animal Health Fund as one word, .org. And there's a kind of a cute little video on that when if you click on About Us, that has some of our researchers explaining the importance of zoo research. So it's better from there because they're doing research. Right. It's better from their perspective than it is from mine, but it's a pretty compelling little video.
Oh, it is. And we'll definitely push it out on our end and our social media and on our website and in our show notes. You know, definitely the species of the week. We always cover an organization. That will be the one. I will tell Angie she has no choice. We will cover that and push that out to our listenership because it is, you know, Rob, thank you so much. It's wow. I think we're going to have to do this one again, or I'm definitely going to contact your wife at some point and set up an interview with her because she's always somebody I've looked up towards in my career and her wealth of information from the reproductive side in wildlife and wildlife medicine. But Dr. Rob Hilsenroth, the executive director of AAVS, thank you so much. Thank you so much for what you do and for spending an hour with us.
Chris, it's my pleasure, and thanks to you for all that you guys do to get the word out. I mean, we need more and more people doing that, and we are very, very appreciative that you're doing what you can to make people just aware, and then that make them think a little bit about what they can do, and everything from recycling and on and on and on to writing a check or using your credit card and donating to these causes. You do a great job, and we appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. And again, for folks, you want to go check out Wild Animal Health Fund. That money, any money you donate goes directly to research for wildlife and health. So thank you.